All right, today we're diving into a strategic model of leadership that's, well, as old as power itself. We're going to look at the very physics of sovereign will and see how, so often, it ends up engineering its own destruction.
And this quote, this really gets to the heart of it. This is the fundamental, tragic law we're examining. See, every system of absolute control, every single vision forced onto reality, carries the seeds of its own collapse. And that's not just some poetic phrase. It's a core principle of how organizations and leaders actually work.
So, what do we mean by the abyssal dialectic? Let's forget the mythology for a second and just think of it as a strategic framework. It describes this high-stakes deadlock, right? It's what happens when a leader's drive to create becomes so total, so absolute, that it can't help but generate an equal and opposite force of pure destruction. You could call it the ultimate executive stress test.
Okay, so let's start at the beginning, with the thesis. This is that first act of creation. It's the archetype of the absolute leader, the grand architect. And in our model, that figure is the king, Glaucus. He embodies that singular vision and, that total, uncompromising control.
Now, this is where it gets really interesting, because we can translate all of this into strategic terms. That Komoda event, think of it as a radical corporate takeover, or maybe a disruptive tech breakthrough that just completely rewrites the rules. His form, a biological computer, that's your perfectly integrated top-down corporate structure where everything flows from the top. Phase shift sorcery is just the ability to dictate every single process with absolute precision. And his ideology, master morality, well, that's the classic top-down vision, where the leader's intellect is the one and only source of truth. But this is the crucial part. This perfect crystalline order has a huge, fatal flaw. When you eliminate every deviation, you create what's called a static museum of the ego. It's a system that's perfectly preserved, sure, but it's completely incapable of adapting. It becomes brittle, fragile, and incredibly vulnerable to any force it can't completely control.
And that kind of vulnerability, well, it's practically begging for a backlash. And that's where the antithesis comes in. This is the force of negation, and it's born directly from the leader's own actions and, frankly, his hubris. This whole process is governed by a core law of organizational physics we call reciprocal assertion. To put it simply, the more absolute your control, the more powerful the resistance you create. Every single top-down directive, every yes from the sovereign, gives birth to an equal and opposite no somewhere else in the system. And this chart illustrates that relationship perfectly. You have to understand, the shadow isn't some external competitor. He's a mirror image of the king's will. The king's crystalline order is met with chaotic flux. His idealism is met with pure nihilism. This spirit who denies is the shadow culture, It's that silent resistance that's not how we do things here, that just festers in the dark corners of any organization that's too rigid. So the key takeaway here is this. The resistance you face in your own organization is a direct reflection of your leadership. The more ambition and hubris you pour into absolute control, the more complex, the more powerful the internal forces working to undermine you will become. You literally create your own demons.
But wait, the conflict isn't just this simple back and forth. The whole situation gets a lot more complicated because an insidious, unexpected threat shows up. And this one doesn't want to fight, it just wants to drain. It's a parasite.
So let me ask you a question. What if, while you're spending all your energy fighting your ideological opposite, the real danger is just a quiet decay, eating away at your foundations? A threat that couldn't care less about your grand vision or the resistance against it. Meet the captain. In strategic terms, this guy is entropy. He's the embodiment of resource depletion, supply chain collapse, technical debt, maybe even brain drain. He's born from runoff energy, all the waste and inefficiency created by that big primary conflict. His chaos water isn't a weapon of war. It's the rot that decays your legacy systems, the talent that just gets up and walks out the door, the slow, quiet drying up of capital and morale. His goal couldn't be simpler. Dehydration. He doesn't want to destroy the king's creation. He just wants to consume its resources until there is absolutely nothing left. He turns the very source of the king's power into a thirsty grave. So while the king and the shadow are locked in this epic battle, the captain? He's just draining the whole system dry.
So we have this triadic nightmare of order, negation, and decay. It really seems inescapable, doesn't it? But it's not. the model actually gives us a path forward, a way to break the deadlock. And it's called the synthesis.
A new variable enters the equation. And it's not another force of opposition or destruction. It's a restorative power, something that fundamentally changes the rules of the entire game. This synthesis is achieved through a totally new leadership model. Figures like Salome come in and introduce restorative principles. Think of things like reinvesting in R&D, or employee wellness programs, or sustainable practices that directly counter the captain's drain. Then you have Chloris, who represents grounding that big vision in reality, the terrestrial yes. It's about connecting grand strategy to the fertile ground of what's actually possible. The goal shifts completely from domination to harmonization, from seeking total control to finding equilibrium among all the forces at play. And that leads us to the ultimate lesson of the abyssal dialectic. Sustainable power, true sovereignty. It's not found in the singular, absolute will of one leader. It's found in the skillful integration, the balancing of all the forces within an organization, the vision, the critique, the resources, and of course, the people. So I'll leave you with this one question to apply to your own world. Take a hard look at your strategy, at your team, at your organization. Is your leadership style building a rigid, brittle monument to your own ego? Or are you cultivating a resilient, adaptive ecosystem that can actually learn, grow, and thrive for generations to come?